Welcome everybody to the Standing Committee on Public Accounts for Tuesday, June 15th. Welcome to my colleagues and to Auditor General and his team for joining us again today. If I can have an adoption of the agenda as presented, please. So moved, Lynn Lund. And so today we're doing a review, continuing the review of the report, and I can see we're doing the 2018 recommendations, sort of that follow-up, the 3-year follow-up. Then we have correspondence and some scheduling business to do as well. So if it's okay with the committee, we'll proceed with the presentation and hold questions to the end, if that works for the committee. Great. Okay, welcome. Nice to see you again.
Good to see everyone here. So a couple of things. We are going to start with this 2017-2018 follow-up recommendations. Then I'm hoping to provide a brief update on the COVID examination that we're doing. And then if we have time, Ryan did contact me after the last meeting indicating you would like a presentation on the climate chapter and on the Advertising Act chapter. So I do have that prepared today if we have time.
Okay.
And before I start, I forgot to do this last meeting. I'll introduce who's here with me. Jennifer Bonus is a Director of Quality Assurance within our office, and Sherry Griffin is a Director of Performance Audit within our office. So I apologize to the ladies for not doing that last time.
We need to get your name tags.
Yes, yeah. Well, hopefully you don't have to be here that much.
Well, maybe not, yeah.
And then before I start, I did provide correspondence to the committee last week. After our meeting, I was contacted by the Secretary to Treasury Board requesting a meeting. So she met with me and informed me that a summary of Treasury Board minutes, decisions that had been provided to our office had contained an error. So the error was related to the homestay discussion that we had last week. I had indicated that Treasury Board had authorized the department to enter into an agreement, but they actually denied that request. So I wanted the committee to understand that at this point that's still unauthorized, so that risk still remains.
Okay. Perhaps does the committee have any questions or comments at that point, or do you want to save that for later? Okay. Thank you for the correspondence. It was much appreciated. I do think there will be some follow-up questions on those at some point, but perhaps we'll proceed with the presentation for now.
Okay, so to start, so our performance audits and examinations include recommendations to improve government processes and protect the interests of island taxpayers. It is important that members of the Legislative Assembly and PE Islanders receive a regular update on the progress the government is making in implementing our recommendations. We report on the implementation of recommendations 3 years after the audit is originally completed, and again in the 4th year following the report. The objective of our follow-up work is to provide limited assurance on those recommendations assessed by management as implemented. So if management indicates that it has not been implemented, we don't look at it. We just look at the ones that they say they've implemented. The scope included recommendations from the 2017 and 2018 annual reports, excluding financial audits. So those 2 annual reports included 60 recommendations from 6 different performance audits that our office had completed. Management provided an assessment on the status of implementation of each of our recommendations as at October 31st, 2020. So we only conduct our follow-up work on recommendations reported by management as being completed up to that date. It's unfortunate, but we have to have a cutoff date, and that's the date that we pick. So if it's done after that, then we really don't get a chance to report on it until the following year. We concluded that as of October 31st, 77% of our recommendations from our audit reports in 2017 had been implemented, and 50% of the recommendations from audits in our 2018 annual report had been implemented. So this chart provides a visual representation of the rates of implementation of recommendations since we began following up. And the years on the bottom of the chart refer to the year we initially reported the recommendations. And further action may be taken subsequent to our last follow-up. So all of those percentages, if you go back to 2014, that shows 76% completed, that would have been based on the fourth year that we looked at it. So in subsequent years, they may have implemented further recommendations, but we haven't looked at it, so we don't update the chart. So the 2018 number at 50%, we expect that will increase next year in the chart. So the rates of implementation have been increasing since 2015, and I hope we continue to see that trend. Management of the audited department, Crown Corporation, or agency has had a number of years to implement these recommendations. Action has been taken on some of the outstanding recommendations, but they are not fully implemented. Management have advised that some of the delays are due to staff shortages, the implementation of IT systems, as well as COVID-19 restrictions affecting department functions. Although the implementation rate has increased, the lengthy delay in implementing these recommendations is still concerning. It is concerning because the recommendations were made to address various weaknesses in internal controls, management practices, and processes, and delays with implementation mean the original risks still remain. So this chart provides a summary of the recommendations implemented and outstanding from the 2017 annual report. So under the climate change performance audit, 88% of our recommendations have been implemented. The Office of the Public Trustee, 75% of those recommendations have been implemented. And the Senior Housing Program, 70% of those recommendations have been implemented. And Appendix A to that chapter, pages 101 to 103, includes the complete list of recommendations for each audit and the status of implementation as of October 31st, 2020. And Appendix D to this chapter, at page 109, it shows management's responses to recommendations that they reported as not completed yet. So for the 2017 annual report follow-up work, this is the second year that we looked at those recommendations, and it will be the final year that we look at them. And the implementation rate did increase to 77% from 43% last year. So that it's positive to see that, especially in light that we just went through a year of pandemic, and they still were able to make some progress. So that's a good sign. This chart is similar to the previous one, except this looks at our 2018 annual report recommendations. So the social assistance program, they had implemented 45% of our recommendations. Medication controls, institutional pharmacy program had implemented 40% of our recommendations. And Office of the Public Guardian had implemented 100% of our recommendations. And we did single them out in our annual report to thank them for doing that. And again, so Appendix B, which is on page 104, it provides a complete list of recommendations for each audit and their status of implementation. And Appendix D, pages 110 to 112, they show management's responses to recommendations that they've reported as not completed yet. So this is the first year that we've looked at the recommendations from our 2018 annual report. 50% of these recommendations were implemented, and later this year we will send correspondence to the departments, Crowns, that had recommendations addressed to them in our 2018 and 2019 annual reports, and we will complete our follow-up work on those recommendations. And then I just wanted to add, this is kind of a change for what our office is going to do in the future with some of our follow-up reporting. In future reports, we will be providing more information on the efforts made to implement recommendations which are not yet complete. Often during our follow-up work, we find that a lot of work has been done on recommendations, but they are not yet at a point where we consider them to be complete. And I think it's important for members of the Legislative Assembly and the public to be aware of the progress that has been made on our recommendations. And it's also important for government entities to see that their efforts are not going unappreciated. So I intend to report a little bit more on progress in the future. So that's the presentation that we have on our follow-up work. So we can take some questions.
Great. Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I don't have a lot of questions, but I do have a couple. In terms of departments that have not completed their recommendations, some of the reasons that were listed were IT shortages, I believe you had, and staff shortages. Did they give you any indication on whether they've asked for a budget to support those things? If these are preventing them from meeting the recommendations that they've known about for years, have they asked for the resources to get there?
So when we do, the follow-up work's not as intense as the actual audit itself when we do it. So we basically, it's limited assurance. We go in and take a small sample to see if they've done it. We don't really get into really detailed interview questions with staff. We just try to confirm if they say it's done, we try to confirm that it's done. If it's not, then we report that it's not. So we didn't have those detailed questions. And I don't, Jennifer, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, when it comes to the IT systems, for example, that primarily is concerning the public trustee audit, and they are very close to having that IT system fully implemented. So in that case, I mean, they were given the budget to do the work they needed to do. So that would be one example where a budget would have been given.
Okay. Lynn?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the clarification on that. I'm particularly concerned about the social assistance program. There's a lot that's not met, and certainly having heard from constituents of mine, I definitely see the impacts of that on the other side. Did that department specifically give you a sense of what their struggles were to meet these recommendations?
Well, they had reported that they felt a lot of them had been completed. When we got into the work, we noted that they weren't completed to our satisfaction. So they are making progress on them. So they really didn't indicate why they weren't, because in their minds they felt they were implemented.
I might add too, Darren, that in this case, they were moving towards some new policies that were implemented, unfortunately, after our cutoff date. They had quite a number of policies that were going to be on a go-forward basis starting November 3rd, 2020, and our cutoff was October 31st, 2020. So unfortunately, because we had to have that date, we didn't look at that new policy being implemented.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Were they aware of that October 31st date ahead of time, out of curiosity?
Yes, it is communicated to them.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. That's really interesting. And can I get a sense of what sort of timeline was originally assigned to these back in 2018, I believe?
I don't have that here. I can get back to you on that as to what their management's responses were to the recommendations at that time.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I think that would be helpful because this many years later, I'm sure your timeline or the Auditor General of the day, his timeline for these to be completed wasn't 2 years out. So I'm curious what sort of window the Auditor General of the day felt was necessary to get these risks mitigated. I think it would be good for us to have a conversation with that department, but I don't think I have any more questions for you. Thank you.
Okay. Gordon?
Thank you, Chair. Just specific into the 2018 annual report around medical controls, institutional pharmacy programs. There's a large number of not complete issues around drugs, narcotics and whatnot within the system. When you looked at that, was there? If those aren't complete now, that's a long period of time. Could you just talk a little bit more about that and your scope looking into that?
So originally, they had indicated that a lot of our recommendations were implemented in those instances that you brought up. But when we did our work, we discovered that they weren't. And we actually had quite a discussion with them on the controls over the narcotics and the controlled substances. So there's a little bit of a difference of opinion, I think, in terms of what they were doing and what we felt they should be doing. So it's not, I guess in one instance, Jennifer can probably provide more details on this, but at the pharmacy in the government, in the Shaw building, they're not conducting regular inventory counts there. So that was one instance. And the other one was at the nursing homes. Jennifer, can you provide a bit more detail on that?
Absolutely. So best practice recommends monthly inventory counts. When we did our work, we selected a sample over a period of time, and they weren't being done monthly. Within the nursing homes, they do have patient-specific strips that are given to the residences, as well as they do hold some small amount of ward stock, and neither of those were being counted on a regular basis. So we still found that was a problem.
Gordon?
So there's a problem in the provincial pharmacy around maybe accountability of the medication, and at the nursing home when it gets there. That was, and then you said that they thought that they had maybe done enough, but when you looked at it, they hadn't. What's that little gray area between done enough and
So like Jennifer indicated, best practices monthly inventory counts. So they were doing inventory counts, but they just weren't doing them regular enough. Mm-hmm. And in the nursing homes, they felt like they had significant controls in place to control the medication. However, the reconciliation to them coming in, going out, wasn't being done, even though they felt they had enough controls that no one could get at them, but there still was a risk that somebody could, or they could go missing.
Gordon?
Do you think this is a situation where the staff at the nursing homes are too stressed with their regular daily activities to look at the inventory, or are they missing boxes on the forms? Where's the issue at the nursing home? Where does it lie? I guess nurses would be prescribing medication there.
I said it'd be more just related to just tightening up their processes a little bit more.
Gordon?
This looked at provincially run government institutions. How does the government monitor the private institutions for similar things, similar inventory issues with medication?
I don't believe that formed. Is that part of the scope?
This wasn't part of the scope
Yeah.
of the audit. But I know those private nursing homes, I believe they do have their own policies around controlling medications.
Gordon?
This just opens up looking at that, and I'd like to maybe in the future look at how transfers going to the private, because if we have a problem within our own provincial system around narcotics and medication going out, I'd like to see where it is privately. That's it for me, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. I just have a question myself. Looking at the social assistance program, most of the items that have been addressed are policy or regulations, but there is one in there which is actually a legislative requirement, and that's the requirement for social assistance rates to be reviewed on an annual basis at Executive Council, or be presented for review on an annual basis at Executive Council, and that's directly in the legislation. Is there any difference in the requirement to respond when there is a legislative requirement versus a policy, or is that not that aspect of it not relevant when you're looking at it from an audit perspective?
Well, it's definitely relevant when we look at it, but in terms of if they don't get authorization from executive council, like all we can really do is point it out. There's really nothing that we can do to enforce it.
Right. And the reason to obviously to raise it is because in the past that annual review not happening means that the rates haven't been increased or reviewed, and that was what was pointed out in the original report. Was
Right.
At that point I think it had been 8 years or 9 years in between there being a last review, and you know I think that's an important point when we talk about these why these things matter. And, you know, as my colleague pointed out, is this is actually, though it's policy and checks and balances, it actually directly impacts the delivery of those programs and services to the clients
For sure.
themselves, who are not at the moment, for instance, getting enough through programs because those rates haven't been reviewed on a regular basis. Are there any other, or has there been any other considerations? Like, does the things that are set in legislation versus policy, does that ever impact what you choose to include in the scope of an audit? Like, how do you determine what is and is not in scope? I think it's a bit of a broad question, but I'm just, in terms of something like this, how would you choose what gets included?
So we usually start with the legislation as a kind of background as to how we want to direct the audit. So in the scope, it evolves throughout the course of the audit. And one of the risks that you have is that your scope gets too broad, and then so you really try to narrow it down to an effective report. So I guess to answer your question, we start with the legislation, and then we kind of go from there.
And my last one on this is a risk analysis part of your recommendations when you make a report to the department? So I'm looking at both of these, but for instance, with the medications piece, where there is actually a significant potential risk, is a risk assessment made or discussed with the department when they're looking at how they choose to prioritize responding, for example?
Yes, yeah, they do. And we meet with, when we have our recommendations, we meet with management to clear our findings, and that gives them an opportunity to point out things that maybe we overlooked or didn't see. But if they do make it into the report, they've been discussed with management, and management has agreed that those risks do exist. And then their responses are, they come right, so whatever we put in the report, those come directly from the departments. We don't switch any of the wording at all, so that's kind of their response to the risks associated with those recommendations.
Okay, thank you for that. That helps sort of get a better picture on the, particularly when you've spoken about a disagreement in interpretation of whether something is complete or not. I certainly hear from you that you're looking at best practices. You're looking at sort of what are other jurisdictions doing, or what does the space out there. That information would be provided by you to the departments in case where you are talking about, is this done or not? Is that how do you what guidance do you provide them so that they know what they're aiming to do in terms of it being complete or not?
In some instances, we have those discussions with departments, but for the most part, we really have to be careful in the recommendations, how we word them. So we want to point out the issue and the risks associated with the issue, but in terms of the corrective action that the department needs to take, we really leave that up to them to make those policy and process decisions, and then we come back and see what they've done. So it's a little tricky in terms of having those conversations about this is how you need to correct it, because then we get in a situation where we're coming back to audit our own work, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I do. I'm when you're talking about safe storage and management of medication, for example, where there is a best practice that says you count how many you have and you count how many should have gone out, and then you count at the end, and it should all match. That that is a pretty logical. Like, I'm not a medication expert, but I understand the logic of doing something like that. So I'm struggling with understanding how there could be a disagreement in principle on whether something is done or not to a best practice, without being really clear what that best practice is. And I'm wondering if, you know, how do you get to some kind of an agreement on that without providing reference or guidance?
Yeah, so in that instance, and Jennifer can correct me or provide a bit more detail, but so on the controlled substance, we felt that they should be doing regular inventory counts, controlling it in and out. Whereas they felt like their procedures where they were locked and certain individuals had keys, that was enough. Whereas we felt they needed to go to that next level. So that's an instance or an example of where
Right.
those differences arise.
Yep.
Does
Okay.
that sum it up, Jennifer?
Yeah. And I mean, to be clear too, like when we do our reports, management is well aware of the standards that we're holding them to at the time that we do the audit.
Okay.
So when we make our recommendations or identify the issues, they are based on what we call criteria that we had established at the first of our audit, and we inform management as to what we base these criteria on, and they agree to them prior to us even beginning our work. So it's not a surprise to them what we're basing it on, and oftentimes it is legislation and policy that the department or the program is supposed to be following anyway. So none of that should be a surprise.
It shouldn't be a surprise. Okay, that helps a lot. Thank you. That I was trying to figure out where is the benchmark that we're working to, so that right at the beginning, and they're
beginning.
agreeing to that at the beginning of the process.
Right, yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Thank you. Corey?
Thank you, Chair. And Darren, I was wondering if you could clarify, I guess, where under seniors housing program, I guess where your staff and their staff didn't quite come to an agreement on if the recommendations were complete or not. I guess more specifically, the Housing Services Division should ensure that housing officers comply with policy in assessing applicants. Did we discuss that?
I
Yeah,
think it was,
Can you clarify that word? Sorry.
under the seniors housing
Yes.
program. Just there was a couple of recommendations that weren't complete. But the staff thought they were, or the department thought they were.
is that 4.41?
Maybe we didn't. Get to
4.4, 4.42, and 4.76?
it. Yeah, sorry.
So it was just the majority of it was related to just lack of documentation on supporting that their policies were being followed in those instances where they had files and they have some documentation within them, but not complete documentation. So that's where they felt that they were doing some of it, but just not completely.
Corey?
Sorry.
That's okay.
So when you say not complete documentation, so not complete documentation when to assess applicants and whatnot, who should be placed, ahead of who, or, because I get a lot of calls on seniors housing, so.
Yeah, so exactly. Point systems, whether they're being calculated accurately. And, Jennifer might have some more specifics on the work that we did in that area.
A lot of it was around supporting housing costs or income of the applicants. So this was the second year we followed up on this particular recommendation. And after our first year, they did implement a new checkbox where social assistance workers were to check off essentially whether or not they did verify what their income and housing costs were. When we went in to do our work this year, we noticed the new assessment forms, but those checkboxes were often not filled out. So they didn't verify. They still didn't verify whether or not those costs or income were looked at by the housing officer.
Did they give any reason why they don't?
Oversight, I believe, would be probably the best way to explain that.
Corey?
And just 4.76, the Housing Services Division should report publicly on the performance of its low-income seniors housing program. Is there any reason why they're not doing that yet? Are they working towards that, or I guess that's almost 4 years now.
Yeah, I believe that was, part of the blame, I guess, on that was that the financial statements were late. We were the auditors, so we were partially to blame, I guess, to that. However, they did switch auditors for this last fiscal year, so I'm not sure where the status of their current reports are. I know they did get caught up on quite a few of them, but I believe they're still a little in arrears.
And we did get, in our correspondence, Ryan put together kind of a summary of the overall housing corporation, which would include some of the seniors' low-income housing, not all of it though, but some of it. And I think that indicates that the financial reports are now, I think up to 2018-19 has been filed. I'll have to double check, but there still are somewhat in arrears. And one of the pieces in there is that the low-income seniors program does not only sit in the housing corporation, it also sits in social assistance, so it remains.
So they weren't reporting publicly because they said they didn't have their audited financial statements for 4 years?
Yeah.
And that's why, like, at our meeting last week, I'd indicated having discussions amongst the members of the Legislative Assembly about, switching some of the legislation and for different crowns, because when a lot of the acts are old, back when annual reports were an actual annual report that was handed out physically, whereas now that most of them are done electronically, I think legislation could be amended to allow them to report on what's important in terms of what their department is doing, and then attach the financial statements at a later time. So I think that's something that should be considered as acts. I don't think it needs to be done specifically, but as acts are put to the floor for amendments, that could be part of the discussion.
Corey?
That's good, Chair.
You're good? Heath?
Just changing the topic a little bit, province-wide risk assessment on climate change is really the only issue remaining. I'm just wondering if you have any indication when that might be completed.
They had indicated that it would be done by the end of this month, so I would expect they'll have something in the public pretty soon.
Okay, thank you, that's much.
Okay. Any further questions from the committee? Or? Good. Thank you very much for that. Thank
Okay.
you.
Well, I think we'll do, what time is it?
It is 22. What are you thinking?
So we'll go right to COVID.
COVID?
Yeah.
So do the COVID, update on the COVID planning?
Okay. So update on our COVID audit. This has been a major undertaking for our office. With limited resources, it's probably one of the biggest audits in terms of numbers of programs that we've ever looked at one time. So just a little bit of background. On April 10th, 2020, the Honorable Dennis King requested the Auditor General under Section 14D of the Audit Act to undertake a special assignment to examine government's COVID-19 pandemic response. In particular, a financial examination of the provincial government COVID-19 programming and supports and the special warrants associated with COVID-19 for the period starting March 13th, 2020 with a report back to Executive Council no later than August 1st, 2021. So the objective of our audit is to determine whether the province of PEI obtained appropriate authorization for the financial support programs in response to COVID-19, and whether they've maintained appropriate oversight and controls over disbursements made under these various programs. And our audit, back in probably 2 or 3 months into our audit, we met with Executive Council to kind of clarify our approach, and we got their agreement to break it down into 3 different phases. So phase 1, these are programs paid using the Emergency Contingency Fund with application deadlines up to and including August 31st, 2020. And we should be issuing a report on phase 1. I was hoping to do it this month, but it will probably be next month that we issue that first report. Phase 2, loan programs, as well as the remaining programs from the Emergency Contingency Fund that had application deadlines after August 31st. And phase 3 were programs established using the COVID-19 Response and Recovery Contingency Fund of $65 million. So the expected deadlines for phase 2 and 3 have not been established at this time because the programs just continue to be deferred for additional time. So it's, at this stage, I'm not really sure when we'll be reporting on those phases. And in actual fact, phase 3 may get reported on before phase 2, just from a timing perspective. So programs funded from the COVID-19 Emergency Contingency Fund were authorized on March 16th, 2020, again on April 15th, 2020, and on April 22nd, 2020. We tested a total of 21 programs with total budgets amounting to $51.5 million. In the next slide, we'll kind of break it down per department, the money allocated to each department under those programs. And exclusions from the scope of our audit include deferral programs, programs paid through existing departmental budgets, and employment program extensions. So there were instances where some of the COVID-19 program money, some of it was paid out of direct budget dollars within departments. If they had saved money from different sources, they just spent it out of their budget, so we didn't get into looking at those. And if there were like job creation programs, for instance, where they might authorize 300 applications in a given year, and with the additional money this year, they were able to process 400. We didn't get into looking at the incremental increases in those programs. It was just, it would have been too much for the scope of what we were trying to achieve. So this chart indicates a breakdown of the expenditures per department. And the 21 programs were managed by 6 different departments and 1 Crown Corporation. So you can see the majority of the funds were through Innovation PEI and the Department of Economic Growth, Tourism and Culture. So the examination phase of the audit is complete now. We are almost finished clearing our findings with the various departments, Crowns, as well as Executive Council and Treasury Board. And we're currently working on the draft report with, as I indicated, an anticipated release in early summer. So finalizing the report it's a time-consuming process. When you have to clear findings with 6 different departments and a Crown Corporation, and then Executive Council and Treasury Board, it takes a long time to schedule those meetings and then clear their findings and take their input to try and draft your final report. And then we have to present the draft report to our Strategic Advisory Committee and get their feedback on it as well. So it's taking a bit of time, but it's going to come out here soon. And the challenges that we did face, as I indicated, it's a lot of meetings. Typically, when we're dealing with one entity, there's one findings meeting. So when you add 7 times that, it complicates the process quite a bit. And we did have the last part of our examination for phase 1, we did experience a delay in getting information from departments to complete our work on whether the province had established processes to monitor and report on the COVID-19 support programs. So that kind of has delayed our process a little bit as well. So that's the update on the COVID report. Like I said, our examination phase, the examination is complete, and our reporting will be out very soon.
Okay. Questions from committee? Many thoughts? Okay. Corey?
Darren, do you feel like you've, like any roadblocks have been put up, or that you've gotten all the information you've asked for? Are you confident in that? When I guess when working with departments and.
Yeah, initially I felt like there was a delay in getting information, but then we did get cooperation after that. So I feel confident that we did get the information that we needed eventually, but initially it seemed to be a bit cumbersome.
Corey?
And was that more so just because of the scope of the work that the departments were doing to roll out the programs, or just, I think that we put out 2 budgets within a number of months, or I
think initially it was because a lot of the Executive Council wanted the information to flow through them to us, which is not very efficient. So then we started to deal with the departments directly, and then that made it a lot easier when we could just deal with them directly, because they're the ones that are administering the programs, and so they're the people that we needed to talk to.
Mm-hmm. Corey?
And why would Executive Council want the information to flow through them initially?
I guess they just wanted to see the information that was being provided to our office.
Why would they need to see that?
I guess just to see what was being presented. I don't know. I wasn't concerned that they were, going through the information and not providing everything, because we did get to deal with the departments directly, so I'm not concerned on that. Why they wanted it to go through them initially, I think it's because the programs were all handled through them initially. So it did make a little sense at the time, but as we got into the audit, we found that we needed to talk to the people on the ground.
And was there any issue with that? There was no issue with that, was there?
No.
No, that's good.
Okay. Okay. Heath?
I was wondering if any departments received additional contingency funding based on what they were actually allocated in their budgets for. Are you aware of any departments getting more funding?
I believe you're referring to the Response and Recovery Fund. The departments were allocated certain amounts, and we didn't do that work yet. Phase 1 was the Emergency Contingency Fund, so Phase 3 will look at that funding.
Heath?
And have you guys ever been contacted on some of that spending to say, is this appropriate to spend on COVID-19 or any of those issues surrounding that at all? No.
Heath?
Just curious if there's any indication on if there's monies left over, since we're at 51 or 52 million, where that money should be placed thereafter. Is it staying in general revenue? Is it going to another contingency fund for future? Or do you guys have any recommendation on that? Or did you?
Well, we haven't issued our final report yet, so I don't know what the final recommendations will be yet. I know there was a couple of programs where there was some significant dollars left over. So until we get to that final stage of the report, I'm not sure what angle we're going to take with that.
Heath?
So the percentages you showed on your chart, those are basically the percentages broken down from the 51.2. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from committee? And Darren, you're just saying, so you're looking at July 2021 for that report to come forward. And then we're not sure yet on the dates, but probably phase 3 report before phase 2?
Possibly.
Yeah.
We haven't started any of our phase 2 or phase 3 work.
Okay. So are you anticipating that we'll see that this year, like within 2021?
A report on phase 2 or 3? No, I would anticipate it'll be 2022 at some point.
Okay.
And again, some of those programs, assuming the pandemic is close to being behind us, the application deadlines will come to an end, and then we can get in and do our work. But as those targets continue to move, there's really not much sense in getting started until that happens.
Okay. Okay. Well, we will probably discuss a meeting for us to have you in when that report comes out. We'll keep that sort of as a marker on our potential scheduling to discuss for later on. Look forward to seeing it. Thank you very much for the presentation. Okay, so we are still ahead of the hour, and Darren and his team had indicated that they had prepared a presentation on the other chapters. So if we have time to do those, so is the committee okay with moving ahead and getting those pieces done as well? Would that be good?
Okay, yep.
Okay, great. Thank you.
They're just small chapters, so
Yeah.
they shouldn't take too long. So we'll do the climate.
Calm. Control yourselves, you two.
So the Climate Leadership Act became official on April 1, 2019. The purpose of the act is to charge a levy on carbon for purchasers and consumers of fuel in an effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Our office is responsible for reporting annually to the Legislative Assembly the amount of levies collected under the act and the amounts returned to consumers, businesses, and municipalities. $13 million was collected as a carbon levy for the period April 1, 2019 to March 31, 2020. $18 million was returned to islanders during that same period through reductions in gasoline tax, free driver's licenses, discounts in motor vehicle registration costs, and subsidies in transit fees. An additional $4 million was returned to islanders through the above noted initiatives between the period of December 29th, 2018 and March 31st, 2019. So the total amounts returned to islanders for the period December 19, 2018 to March 31, 2020 were $9 million higher than the amounts collected from the carbon levy. There is now a 5-year active transportation fund in place beginning in the 2021 fiscal period. This fund will help build new walking and biking paths, install paved shoulders, and better connect existing walking and cycling trails to grow PEI's active transportation network. These initiatives seem to be more in line with the intended purpose of the Climate Leadership Act. So that's just brief.
Why am I not surprised? Lynn?
I definitely have a couple of questions on this one. I know it's not a big chapter, but when I review the Climate Leadership Act, which I'm very familiar with, it says that the revenue collected under it may be used only to provide rebates or adjustments. And I'm not convinced that we could consider active transportation a rebate or an adjustment. And I'm wondering if we have looked to see that the money being used under the Climate Leadership Act is following its own legislation.
So really we didn't do an audit per se. We just reported on what they collected and how they gave it back. So we didn't do a specific audit in terms of if it was in accordance with their legislation. It was just really confirming what they collected and then how they dispersed it back.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I didn't realize we were going to go through this chapter, or I would have brought the legislation with me, but there's a purpose section in it that talks specifically about how to use the revenue. And I have raised it to previous ministers that I believe we are not in alignment with what the legislation says we must do with that money. I would be interested to know your comments on how a person could confirm whether or not we are in alignment with that. If that was not part of this review, would you have any advice?
Well, it could, if you wanted us to do a special investigation on that, we could. It's not part of what we typically report on annually within that act, but if there's additional procedures requested, then we could incorporate that.
Okay. Lynn? Corey? No? Gosh. Well, there we go. That was brief.
Sure.
Oh. Sydney?
So when you did the review, is there anything in the act stating, like, it's fairly obvious that, you know, we spent 18 million and we only collected, what, 13, 14 million, right? So we gave away more free stuff than the money we took in. Is there anything in the act that protects us against that type of pre-election spending?
No, the act just basically says to give it back, what you collect. So I think it was an instance where I don't think there was adequate controls in place monitoring how much had been provided back. And by the time they actually got a handle on it, they just shut it off. So that's enough.
Sure.
Sydney?
When you talk to them about some of the things that they've replaced those programs with, do you have a sense that they have a better, you know, governor on that this time, like an overspend?
I haven't really got into looking at this year's, what they did, so I can report a bit better on that next year, but we really didn't get to look at the new fund that they put in place.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Second call. No further questions on that? Okay. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Okay, another short chapter. So the Government Advertising Standards Act. So basically, all I wanted to do with this presentation was make you aware of some of the standards within the Act. And then I'll just report on, we did have one request through the year, so I can just update you on that. So the advertising standards within the Act require that advertising meet the following standards. It shall be a reasonable means of achieving one or more of the following purposes: to inform persons of current or proposed government policies, programs, or services available to them, to inform persons of their rights and responsibilities under the law, to encourage or discourage specific social behavior in the public interest, or to promote the province or any part of the province as a good place to live, work, invest, study, or visit, or to promote any economic activity or sector of the province's economy. It shall include a statement that the item is paid for by the Government of Prince Edward Island. Subject to subsection 4, it shall not include the name, voice, or image of a member of the Executive Council or a member of the Legislative Assembly. It shall not be partisan, and it shall not use the name or an image or logo identified with a registered political party. It shall not be a primary objective of the item to foster a positive impression of the government party or a negative impression of a person or entity that is critical of the government. Subject to subsection 5, it shall not include, to a significant degree, a color associated with the governing party other than an approved corporate color of the government of Prince Edward Island and its approved trademark and word mark. It shall meet any additional standards that may be prescribed. So that's kind of the standards. There's some exceptions within the Act, but those are really the standards. So we did receive one request during the year in September. It was under Section 5.1 of the Act, and we determined that the proposed advertising item was in accordance with the Act. And it was specifically related to, it fell under one of the exceptions because Minister Myers was part of the marketing campaign, and it was in conjunction with Energy Efficiency Day in Canada, and he and a radio personality toured the island to visit all the different electric vehicle charging stations. So it was part of a national campaign that met the exception within the Act.
Okay. Any questions from committee? What is the process for somebody who does want to raise something under the Advertising Standards Act? How does somebody go about doing that?
So they have to contact our office. Okay. There's a specific request that they have to do, and it can be done, so the request can come to us either before the advertising starts to make sure it's going to be in line, or it can come in after. So if somebody saw an advertisement that they didn't think met the standards, then they could ask us to investigate it.
Okay. And that can be done by anybody, like a member of the public, or is it only by members of government?
It's only by, is that?
I believe it has to be a member of the Assembly.
Member of the Assembly?
Legislative Assembly.
Okay. So in that instance, a member of the public could raise an issue, but they'd have to raise it with their MLA, who would raise it on their behalf. Okay. Just for background on that. I remember working on the legislation, but I couldn't remember the details myself. So.
And I know some of the other jurisdictions in Canada that don't, the Auditor General Office doesn't have to report on the standard. They've actually, so Ontario is the one jurisdiction that I think of, they actually have an entity that does it, and it's a full-time job. I guess they get a number of requests on the advertisement, so I guess it just, in terms of any amendments that you might consider to that act, keep in mind that it would put an awful onus on our office if we were requested to look at a number of advertising items. So just to keep that in mind. We were concerned when the legislation came out because depending on the requests that we did receive, it could take quite a chunk of our resources to deal with it.
Yes. The question on a general basis, Darren, is about resourcing for your department. And I know this is something that it comes up in different spaces, but given that there are a number of different, you've got unexpected activity like the COVID audit, and then these other pieces of legislation that, for instance, I expect the Advertising Act may get a little busier during an election period, for example. Do you have the capacity in your office to bring on staff on a contract basis? Or is there a discussion that needs to be had about resource capacity for your office, given that we are beginning to think already about sort of the next budget submissions and those kind of things? We were always thinking about budget submissions, but...
Well, in the past, the office was hesitant to request additional resources for staff. Since I've taken on the position, I've hired 3 new auditors, and we're currently looking for another one. But it's not as easy to say we need 6 people and I can find 6 people. Because just this spring, we did receive, our budget was approved for 2 additional auditors. We advertised in March and we didn't receive 1 single applicant. So I did reach out through my LinkedIn network, and we did find an individual, and we're currently advertising the position again. So it's very difficult to find people. I'd like to say yes, we could use more people, but it's really difficult to find them. And in terms of contracting people, depending on the work that's being done, it's very, especially the performance audit, it's really specialized skill set that you're looking for. So it's very difficult to, you almost need to train those people from within. So it's difficult.
Okay, useful information, thank you. Are there any other questions from committee for this time? No? I think we're good for today.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Great.
Great. So thank you very much again for your time. And I think we're seeing you again next week.
Next Tuesday, and I think that
Yes.
should be,
That'll be
I
the.
think we should cover everything next Tuesday.
Yep, that's the plan right now. So unless things change.
Okay.
Okay. So see you then.
Thanks.
So we'll take a brief adjournment for well reset.
See you.
Okay, we're back in committee to complete the agenda. We have correspondence to review as prepared by Ryan. And these had been previously circulated by email, but we have the June 9 letter from the Auditor General providing follow-up from the last meeting, which is primarily around the survey responses as requested by committee, and particularly looking at those survey responses where we did not receive a response, or there was very minimal response. There is a June 10 letter from the Auditor General regarding a correction to the information given in the last meeting, and that refers to, as he mentioned during his presentation, the inaccurate confirmation around the homestay provider contract, indicating that in fact there is not a contract in place, and a research brief clarifying the apparent lack of response to the committee's 2019 request to the PEI Housing Corporation regarding the audited financial statements. Ryan, if I could ask you, I think we had talked about the letters from the Auditor General, or we've had those, but could you just go through could we go through the research brief, the findings regarding the Housing Corporation?
Sure.
Yeah?
So yeah, at the last meeting, Ms. Lund noticed that in the list on the work plan summary, there was an apparent non-response to one of the letters the committee sent out, and that was about audited financial statements of the Housing Corporation. And I thought at the time that they had addressed that in a different letter on another topic. So I went back and checked the correspondence, and indeed they did discuss the reason for their missing annual report and audited financial statements from that year in a letter that was about implementation of their of the AG's recommendations on the seniors housing program. And then in the research, so I quoted that letter in the research brief here, explaining it, and also quoted an excerpt from the Housing Corporation's appearance before the committee last October. And the Auditor General mentioned today too, it had to do with who was designated as auditor under the relevant act. That act was amended so that they can hire an external auditor essentially to do their audited financial statements. So, in the last page of the research brief here, there's a little table that shows their most recent 3 annual reports, the date they were tabled, the auditor that they had audit their financial statements, and the date that the auditor signed off on those statements. So all those 3 annual reports came in the January-February period, and as you can see, the most recent 2 are with an external auditor.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you for that, Ryan. It's really, really helpful. Are there any comments or discussion from committee? No? Okay. So then we'll move to item 5, which is scheduling. As we had discussed last week and earlier, we have the Auditor General coming back in next Tuesday to complete the review of the 2021 report, any remaining items. We then have the Comptroller on the week following, and so that takes us to the end of June with scheduled meetings. We have had a couple of items already that we've kind of raised that are potentially to be scheduled for discussion in this committee. One of them is the pending COVID report that we just heard about earlier this morning, which will be some point in July. There's also been a couple of departments that have been mentioned for follow-up, both from last week and this week, in terms of sort of particularly outstanding issues that are not able to be resolved through discussion with the Auditor General that want to be followed up with the committee. So I'd asked the committee to consider priority for scheduling, keeping in mind that we do want to ensure that we are looking at the calendar as much as possible and understanding that we have flexibility in how we manage our own schedule. Should we not schedule any meetings in the summer, then we will be looking at scheduling into September. The House will sit again mid-October. The other consideration is to ensure that we do leave time for families to be able to have time with their families, but that certainly in the last few years we have had a very heavy summer committee schedule. So it's trying to find a balance there of doing the work in a timely manner, but also and recognizing that work-life balance is part of the story for committee members. So that's the context. How do committee feel, and what do they feel are the priorities that we should be looking at, given some of the discussions that we've had? Any comments? Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I would be interested in following up on the social assistance program. I think that there were a number of issues that were raised that are worth hearing from the department on, whether that's over the summer or in September. I'm flexible on that.
And there's, Lynn, to clarify, there's the social assistance program, there's also the seniors housing program, which would be different contacts within the same department.
Exactly. So perhaps we want to have the department in to talk about some of the outstanding recommendations.
Yeah? Sounds good, okay. Yes, Corey says yes, okay. Gord?
Yeah, again, in the 2018 report, which I asked some questions today, I'd be interested in, but I think that can wait till maybe September, or try to book it in with September. There's no, it's no real rush to do it in the summer, but again, like you mentioned, the COVID, if we do get information there, I'd be willing to come in anytime as a committee member to discuss that.
Would the committee be okay with scheduling a meeting when that COVID report comes out to discuss that? It'll be like sometime in July, but otherwise the department calls, we'd do those in for the fall, early fall. Would that work for you? Yeah. So we had social assistance and seniors housing, both from the social development and housing department, and that was specifically to look at the follow-up on those recommendations. Were there other areas that we had talked about the international student program last, and there were recommendations from that. And then the other one was government corporations and their response to the surveys, which also includes, again, the Housing Corporation. Pardon me?
No, I said the housing one, so those are the ones that stood out.
Yeah.
As far as that, so I think you covered it, but.
Okay, so that would also be on the agenda for bringing that department in. Would be also talk to the response about the responses to the surveys as well from a governance perspective. Would that be appropriate? It's a pretty heavy day for Lynn.
Thank you, Chair. I absolutely think we need to have a discussion with the Department of Education on the International Students Program, particularly in light of the fact that we just learned today the government is not moving forward to get a policy in place with a stay provider.
Yeah.
So I think that has to be added to our agenda.
Yeah. I would perhaps suggest to the committee that we'll get an update on that information from Treasury Board via the Auditor General next week, and then we can determine from there the urgency of that. But for now, definitely have it on the agenda that we would like to talk to the Department of Education about that program with a timeline to be determined.
Ideally, Chair.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Ideally before September, when students are back in that situation, would be preferable.
Okay. Committee? Heath?
Yeah, just while we're on that, I know the letter to you and Corey referenced the, from Cindy Hare, Secretary of Treasury Board. I'm just wondering, it doesn't indicate that there was amendment made to Treasury Board, or has been any public addressing of this issue been established? I mean,
Not as far as we're aware, no.
maybe we should ask that question, if there's been any amendment to the Treasury Board minute that was passed by Treasury Board based on based on an error was incorrect, but I mean, where's the trail, I guess, is what I'm asking, Ryan. Because usually that's pretty extensive. There's a lot of checks and balances through Treasury Board that gets, so it'd be interesting to see what they've done on that.
Would it be, and forgive me because I actually don't know, so I'm asking, do we ask the Treasury Board to explain their role in this, if when it comes to, and especially around the contracts piece, around for international students? Is that something that may be on the agenda? Okay, so Treasury Board and the Department of Education regarding the...
Chair.
Sydney?
Sorry, are you suggesting that we invite the treasury board in? Or
I'm
you're just
asking-
seeking clarification on this transaction? Or are you seeking clarification on what their role with the program with international students is?
Heath has asked for that specifically on this transaction right now, to follow up on that one. I am asking the question because I actually don't know, is at what point do we need to talk to Treasury Board about this process and their role in the process of the contractual agreements or not for international students. But certainly, you know, to Lynn's point, the initial inquiry is with the Department of Education. And that would be the priority. And Lynn, you'd indicated you'd like to have that meeting prior to the fall because of the intake of students. Would that be acceptable to the committee? Sydney?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was going to say, you had suggested leaving that till next week, but do you just want to, if the committee's in favor, do you just want to book that now and then?
The question for next week is specifically about that one contract, which is a big one, which is to do with the homestay.
I agree, but you had said about Lynn's request of leaving that till next week.
You're right, sorry, I was following two different threads of
That's okay.
thought there, so yes, it's entirely up to the committee. We can, right now, we're talking about scheduling a tentative to be determined meeting in July, a meeting in September with social development, and then a to be determined meeting with the Department of Education on the international student program. We could ask the clerk to reach out and find availability and then start working from there. Sydney, would that work?
It's Lynn's motion suggestion, so I'll leave it up to her and her timeline.
Thanks.
Were there any other priorities for scheduling at this point that have come up in the last couple of presentations? Sydney?
I just want clarification on this treasury board thing. So are we asking the committee? Are we writing them a letter? Like I still don't have clarification what we're doing.
Sure.
Are we going to write a letter to them to say explain what this mistake, like how that process went?
Heath?
Yeah, I think so. That's what, exactly, and,
I like that.
yeah, just,
Okay.
we need clarification. I mean, all we're seeing here, there was an error made, so there must be an amendment to that minute, Treasury Board minute, so.
Yeah.
I assume it would be. So
Yeah.
either show us the process and then send us the amendment. I think that would be,
Yep. Okay, so a motion from Heath to seek that in writing for clarification, Sid? Yeah, is that clear? Okay,
I'm sorry, Chair.
certainly.
Just the to be determined about the Department of Education's
We'll
coming in.
we'll wait as Sid's indicated and as I had said at the beginning.
I said we shouldn't wait till next week. I was saying there was a request for them to come in. You had said we'll push that off until next week, but we actually didn't deal with the request, was my only point. So I would say
I'm
we
hearing
deal with it
that
now.
we should go ahead and try and book that
Yeah.
for before September. So let's make that a summer meeting one. If we can manage to get them lined up, that we have that under our cover, that would be great, but it is a priority to get it done before the fall. Whereas social development can wait until September. Okay, yes. That was a little muddy, sorry about that, thank you. Does that make, yeah, we got it, okay. Corey?
Last week on the international student program, there was a business plan or business plans referenced. I'm not sure if anyone on the committee recalls what,
There was,
I'm trying to think of the correct name of it.
yeah, there was a strategic plan that they had
Yes.
originally done or hoped to do in 2015 that never got anywhere and nobody's seen it. And then there was another one that was in progress but has not been completed, was my recollection.
I'm wondering if the committee could request to see that.
Yeah,
from the
even a
department.
draft, yeah. A request from the Department of Education for their strategic plan for the international student program.
If the committee's all right with that.
Yeah, is the committee in support of that? Yeah, okay, thank you, Corey. Okay. Well, there's any other items that we feel we should be thinking about for scheduling at this time? No? Any new business? No? Sid, you okay? I don't want to cut you off. Okay.
Just trying to find the quarters on it.
So if there's no other new business at this time, then I'll call for an adjournment of meeting. So moved. Heath? Thank you.
Thank you.